The moment I walked into that hearing room, my son leaned over to his wife and smiled. It was a small smile, the kind people make when they already know how something ends. The kind I had spent 31 years learning to read. He didn't know I was reading it now. The magistrate hadn't looked up yet. She was reviewing papers at the bench, her reading glasses low on her nose. Then she reached the second page, and she stopped. She lifted her head slowly, the way people do when something doesn't match what they were expecting. Her eyes found me across the room, and for just a moment, her expression changed completely. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said carefully, and there was something in her voice that made my son's smile disappear. Are you Linda Hartwell, from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network?" The room went very quiet. My daughter-in-law's hand tightened around her pen. I set my folder on the table and said, "Retired. But yes, I want to tell you how we got there. Because the ending only makes sense if you understand the beginning. And the beginning, like most painful things in life, started with kindness. Or something that wore kindness like a costume. I retired 2 years ago at 62, 31 years with FinCEN, tracking financial fraud, money laundering, assets hidden in shell companies across 4 continents. I was good at my job. I was very good at my job. When I left, my supervisor said the unit was losing its best pattern recognition analyst. I told him I was going home to tend my garden and finally read the stack of novels on my nightstand. He laughed. He knew me well enough to know I wouldn't last 6 months without a problem to solve. He wasn't entirely wrong. My husband passed 4 years before I retired. That was the real reason I left when I did the office, started feeling like a place I was hiding, and I had promised myself I would stop hiding. So I went home to the house in Claremont, the one my husband and I had bought when my son was 7 years old, and I started learning how to be still. My son called every Sunday. That was how it had always been, Sunday calls, 20 minutes, whatever was happening in his week. He lived 40 minutes away with his wife, and they came for dinner once a month, sometimes twice. It was a good arrangement. I wasn't the kind of mother who needed to be managed, and he wasn't the kind of son who tried to manage me. We had an understanding built over decades. Then his wife got laid off. I didn't think much of it at first. These things happen. She had worked in finance, private wealth management for a firm that downsized its advisory team. She was sharp, my daughter-in-law. Organized. She had always made me slightly uneasy in the way that very organized people sometimes do, because organization taken past a certain point starts to look like control. But she made my son happy, and she had always been perfectly pleasant to me, so I kept that observation to myself where it belonged. The change in their behavior started about 3 months after she lost her job. It was subtle at first. My son started calling more often, twice a week instead of once. Then every other day. The calls were warmer than usual, longer, and they had a quality to them I couldn't quite name, a gentleness that felt slightly practiced. He started asking questions he'd never asked before. Was I eating enough? Was I sleeping well? Had I been to the doctor lately? Had I remembered to call the insurance company about that thing we discussed? We hadn't discussed anything, but I assumed I had forgotten something routine and let it pass. Then my daughter-in-law started calling too. She never used to call me separately. Now she called on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She asked the same kinds of questions. Had I been to the pharmacy? Was the heat working in the house? She had heard it was supposed to be cold this week. Did I have enough groceries? I am not a woman who is easily confused about what is happening around her. I noticed the pattern. I just didn't understand the purpose of it yet. The first concrete thing I noticed was the calendar. I keep a paper calendar in my kitchen. I know that sounds old-fashioned, but I spent 30 years working with digital systems sophisticated enough to be falsified, and there is something I trust about ink on paper. My calendar had an appointment marked for the second Tuesday of the month, my regular lunch with my friend Ruth, something we'd done without fail for 11 years. I arrived at the restaurant and Ruth wasn't there. I waited 20 minutes and called her. She sounded confused. She said we had canceled. She said I had called her the week before and told her something came up. I had not called her. I drove home with a peculiar feeling in my chest. Not panic, I don't panic easily, but attention. The kind of full-body attention I used to feel at the start of an investigation when something small reveals that something larger is wrong. I went to my calendar and looked at it carefully. The Tuesday lunch was still marked. But in the previous week, a line had been drawn through a Thursday entry I didn't recognize, and beside it in handwriting similar to mine but not quite mine was written, called, "Ruth, cancel lunch." Someone had written in my calendar. I photographed it with my phone before I said anything to anyone. The incidents accumulated after that. I started paying the kind of attention I used to pay to financial ledgers, methodical, exhaustive, suspicious of coincidence. A book moved from my nightstand to the kitchen table. A casserole dish I always kept in the lower cabinet appeared in the upper one. My spare house key, which I kept on a hook by the back door, was missing for 3 days and then reappeared. Small things. Nothing you could point to individually and call alarming. But I had spent my career finding embezzlement schemes that hid in small things, a decimal point here, a transferred date there, and I knew that small things arranged in a pattern are never actually small. I started keeping notes. A private document on my laptop, password protected, logged by date and time, every misplaced object, every appointment that was supposedly changed without my knowledge. Every conversation where my son or my daughter-in-law gently, carefully, lovingly referenced something I had allegedly forgotten. The picture that emerged was systematic. My daughter-in-law had access to my home. I had given her a key 2 years ago when I'd had minor surgery and needed someone to water my plants. I had never asked for it back, because it had never occurred to me that I needed to. I trusted her. More specifically, I had never had a reason not to trust her, which is a different thing, and I knew that distinction better than most. I changed the locks on a Wednesday morning, quietly, while my son was at work. I told no one. That same week, I called a woman I had worked with for 12 years, a forensic document examiner who had retired 6 months before I did. I drove to her house with my calendar and the birthday card my daughter-in-law had sent me the previous spring. My former colleague put on her magnifying visor, looked at both documents for 4 minutes, and told me the handwriting in my calendar was an attempted imitation of mine, good enough to fool a casual observer, not good enough to fool her. I drove home and sat in my kitchen for a long time. When I worked financial crimes, I used to tell new analysts that the hardest cases weren't the ones with the most complex fraud. The hardest cases were the ones where you were personally connected to the suspect, where the betrayal was intimate, where every piece of evidence you gathered required you to also grieve. I understood that now in a way I hadn't fully understood it before. I didn't confront my son. I know that might seem strange, but I had learned long ago that confrontation is almost always the wrong move when you are still in the information-gathering stage. Confrontation tells the other party what you know, and once they know what you know, they adjust, they destroy things, they rehearse. So, I smiled at Sunday dinner. I laughed at my son's jokes. I let my daughter-in-law show me a new recipe app on her phone and told her it was very clever, and I kept watching. It was my granddaughter who broke it open, though she didn't know she had. She is 11 years old, and she comes to stay with me sometimes on weekends when her parents want an evening to themselves. She was sitting at my kitchen table doing homework on a Saturday afternoon when she looked up and said, very casually, the way children say things they don't realize are significant, "Grandma, is Aunt Carol coming to live here?" I kept my expression completely neutral. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" She shrugged and went back to her worksheet. "I heard Mom on the phone saying something about the house, that you might not want to live here by yourself anymore, and that it would be better for everyone if things were arranged differently." She looked up again. "I told her I thought you liked living here." She said I didn't understand. I told my granddaughter she was very smart and gave her a snickerdoodle from the jar on the counter. After she went to sleep that night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a legal pad, and I wrote down everything I knew. I wrote it out like a case file, because that is how I think, and because putting things in writing forces a rigor that thinking alone doesn't always achieve. My daughter-in-law had lost her income. My son's salary was comfortable but not exceptional. They had a mortgage on a house that had been purchased at the top of the market. My home in Claremont was paid off, and worth considerably more than when we'd bought it, given what property in the area had done over 30 years. And I had savings, a federal pension, careful investments, a retirement account my husband and I had built together over decades. Not a fortune, but substantial, enough to matter. The pattern of the fake forgetfulness, the moved objects, the altered calendar, it was a groundwork, a paper trail being constructed to support a narrative. And the narrative, I understood now, was incompetency. They were building a case to have me declared unable to manage my own affairs. If they succeeded, my son could petition for guardianship of my finances, my house, my decisions. I finished my tea. I washed the cup and set it on the drying rack, and then I went to my desk and opened my laptop and started making calls. Not that night. It was too late, but first thing the following Monday morning, I still knew people. 31 years in federal financial investigation leaves you with a very particular network. I called a former colleague who now worked with an elder law attorney. I called a private investigator I had collaborated with on 2 cases in the 90s who had since built a solid regional practice. I called my own financial advisor and asked him to pull every account statement going back 18 months and flag any irregularities. He called me back in 4 hours. There was a joint account, one I had opened years ago with my son's name on it as a secondary holder, meant as a convenience for emergencies, something I had set up when he was first starting out, and I wanted him to have access to funds if something happened to me unexpectedly. I had largely forgotten about it. The balance had been modest, sitting quietly. Over the past 14 months, that account had been drawn down in increments, never more than $4,000 at a time, transferred to an account I did not recognize. The total removed was $63,000. I looked at that number for a long time. My financial advisor asked if he should call the bank's fraud department. I told him to wait. I told him to document everything and to send me copies of every statement and transfer record, and to wait. The private investigator took 3 weeks. What he found was methodical and unsurprising to a woman who had spent her career identifying exactly this kind of scheme, the incremental transfers. The secondary account opened in my daughter-in-law's name, but using a variation of my address. The pattern designed to move money slowly enough that it wouldn't trigger automatic alerts. She had been careful. She just hadn't been careful enough, because she had never expected anyone to look. The filing for guardianship came on a Thursday. My son's attorney sent the paperwork to my address, and there was something almost surreal about standing at my front door, reading a legal document that characterized me as a woman experiencing significant cognitive decline and requiring oversight for my own protection. The document referenced specific incidents, forgotten appointments, misplaced items, a neighbor who had apparently been approached and had stated she had noticed me seeming confused on 2 occasions. I didn't know the neighbor had been approached. I added that to the file. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out, in front of a magistrate at the county courthouse. I spent those 6 weeks building the kind of case I used to build for federal prosecution. Organized, documented, airtight. My former document examiner colleague provided a sworn statement about the calendar. The private investigator's findings went to the elder law attorney. The bank records and transfer history went to the elder law attorney. I provided a sworn deposition of my own professional history and credentials. My financial advisor provided a complete accounting of my assets and a statement attesting to my full comprehension of every decision I had made in our working relationship. I also quietly contacted the detective unit of the county sheriff's office, not to report anything, just to introduce myself and to mention that I had documentation of potential financial elder abuse that I would be making available to appropriate authorities following a civil hearing. They were very interested. I did not tell my son any of this. I answered his Sunday calls. I had dinner with them twice during those 6 weeks. I let my daughter-in-law recommend a podcast she liked and told her I would give it a try. My son watched me carefully at dinner in a way he probably thought was subtle. I gave him nothing to work with. The morning of the hearing, I dressed in the gray wool blazer I used to wear to federal court. I drove myself. I arrived 12 minutes early and was already seated at the respondent's table when my son and his wife came in with their attorney. My son's expression when he saw me was briefly, genuinely surprised. He had perhaps expected me to look scattered, uncertain, the way their documentation described me. I nodded at him calmly. His wife looked at her shoes. Their attorney approached mine and said something in a low voice. My attorney, who had 30 years in elder law and the quiet confidence that comes with it, listened and then shook her head. The magistrate came in. Everyone rose. She settled at the bench and opened her file, and I watched her face as she read, the way I had watched hundreds of faces over 31 years watching for the moment comprehension shifted to recognition. She turned the second page, and she stopped. She looked up, found me across the room. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said. And then, "Are you Linda Hartwell? From the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network?" My son's attorney paused mid-sentence. My son turned to look at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something between confusion and the first cold edge of understanding. "Retired," I said. "But yes." The magistrate set her glasses down. She looked at my son's attorney and said, "Measured and even, I reviewed financial crime cases for 6 years before moving to civil practice. Mrs. Hartwell's unit was involved in 3 prosecutions I presided over during that time. I want to understand the basis of this petition very carefully before we proceed." My attorney stood. She said, "Your Honor, the respondent welcomes that careful review. We have filed a response with supporting documentation, financial records, forensic handwriting analysis, and a private investigator's report. We would also note that the County Sheriff's Financial Crimes Unit has been made aware of certain matters that may be relevant to these proceedings." The silence in that room was very complete. My daughter-in-law's pen dropped from her hand and hit the floor. She did not pick it up. What followed was not a short hearing. It took most of the day, and I will not pretend it was without pain. Watching my son's face as the documentation was presented, the bank transfers, the handwriting analysis, the manufactured evidence of my supposed confusion, was one of the harder things I have done in a life that has included hard things. He had not known about the money, I believe that. His face, when that was laid out, had a quality of genuine shock that I have seen enough to trust. He had known about the guardianship plan. He had participated in the campaign to make me look confused. But the money, the $63,000 moving out of that account, he had not known. His wife had been conducting her own scheme alongside the one they had planned together. The petition for guardianship was denied. The magistrate was thorough and formal and gave nothing away in her tone, but she denied it on the record with language that left no ambiguity. The documentation I had submitted was entered into the record in full. The referral to the Sheriff's Financial Crimes Unit became a formal investigation before the month was out. My son called me the evening after the hearing. He had sent his wife home to her mother's. I found out later, and he called me from his car in the parking lot of a grocery store because I think he needed to be somewhere without walls. He cried. My son is not a man who cries easily, and the sound of it was something I had to hold carefully, like something fragile you're not sure won't break. He said he was sorry. He said it several times, in different ways, the way people do when they're not sure the word is adequate to what they mean. I told him I knew. I told him I had known him for 40 years, and I understood the difference between the choices he had made and who he was, even if those choices were going to have consequences he needed to face. We talked for a long time. About his wife, about what he had let himself believe, about how fear about money and about the future had made him willing to do something to me he would never have believed himself capable of. I have had difficult conversations in my life. This was among the more difficult, but I did not hang up, and he did not hang up. And at the end of it, I said, "Come for dinner on Sunday," and he said he would. That was 4 months ago. Things are not repaired. That would be too simple a word for something that broken. But they are being repaired, slowly, the way things actually mend, with attention and time and a willingness to keep showing up, even when it's uncomfortable. My daughter-in-law is facing legal proceedings. I am not involved in those. What she did was a decision she made, and it will have outcomes she will have to reckon with. That is not my work to do. My work, I have decided, is this: the garden, which is finally starting to look the way I always imagined it would. Sunday dinners, which my son has not missed in 4 months. My granddaughter, who comes on weekends and sits at my kitchen table doing homework and who told me recently, without any context, that she thought I was probably the smartest person she had ever met. I told her that was a very kind thing to say. She looked at me with the frank assessment children are capable of before they learn to soften their observations, and she said, "I don't mean it as a compliment, Grandma. I mean it as a fact." I laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep in your chest. I spent 31 years learning to read people their tells, their patterns, what their small movements reveal about what they're thinking before they've decided to think it. And I will tell you what I know for certain. The people who underestimate the quiet woman in the corner are never the dangerous ones. The dangerous one is the quiet woman herself. My son and his wife had forgotten, somewhere along the way, that I had built my entire career on the premise that every transaction leaves a trace. Every fabrication has seams. Every scheme, no matter how carefully constructed, was built by a human being who made assumptions, and the most common assumption people make is that no one is paying the right kind of attention. I have always been paying the right kind of attention. They just forgot to account for that. I had my granddaughter over last Saturday. She brought a friend from school, and the two of them sat in the garden in the late afternoon light while I brought them lemonade and listened to them talk with the total absorption of 11-year-olds who haven't yet learned to be self-conscious. My granddaughter's friend looked at the garden and said it was beautiful. My granddaughter said, "My grandma built it herself. She can build anything." I didn't say anything. I went back inside and stood at the kitchen window for a moment and looked at the two of them in the garden. Then I went to put the kettle on. Some things, I have learned, you don't need to say out loud. The work speaks for itself. It always has.